Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar, Returning to Work, Contact Tracing and Beyond. This event is brought to you by Security Magazine, and it is sponsored by Everbridge. I'm your moderator. I'm Diane Ritchie, the Editor-in-Chief of Security Magazine, and thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today. We hope everyone is still staying safe and healthy. Today's presenter is Claudia Dent. She is the Senior Vice President of Product Marketing for Everbridge. She previously served in the role of Senior Vice President of Product Management for more than 7 years, where she led the company's rapid product expansion and diversification to become the global leader in critical event management. Claudia has more than 20 years of experience in the technology industry, and she has held executive positions in product management, marketing, business development, and general management at companies ranging from startups to large global enterprises, including IBM, Rational Software, Interleaf, CompuWare, and Gomez. Just a reminder to submit your questions, as later in the program, Claudia will address them. Today's event is also being recorded and archived on securitymagazine.com. Okay, thank you, everyone, and I'm going to turn it over to today's presenter, Claudia Dent.
Diane, thank you so much, and everyone, welcome to our webinar today. I think we are all aware that our world today stands really at a challenging juncture, where that road to recovery is fraught with a lot of challenges and a changing landscape. So our purpose today is to really explore, how can the world recover? How can the world recover from COVID-19, something that none of us ever probably dreamed or expected would have the impacts that it's had on our daily lives? Well, there's a lot of complexity to manage. So this whole process of recovering really has three major tenets to it. The first is all around knowing the landscape, understanding the landscape and how that COVID-19 landscape is changing. But it's also beyond just that. It's understanding other risks that intersect with COVID-19 to create a perfect storm. How do you manage recovering your operations around the world? That's incredibly complex as well when we have a global economy, different regulations, everyone is at different phases of reopening. But most importantly, that third tenet is, how do we protect our people during these processes and during this recovery period? So we know that conditions are changing around the world, right? I don't have to review the headlines with you. We see them every day. There was a recent outbreak in Beijing. We understand the surge in the United States and Texas and Florida. It's not a straight line, this road to recovery. And unfortunately, COVID-19 is not going away until the time of which we have a very effective vaccine. So we're going to really have to manage in this turbulent time by taking advantage of these three major tenets that I talked about. Because not only are these challenges occurring, but there's a phased approach to reopening with every region and state. And not only that, those aren't going in a straight line either. We understand we're backtracking. We open up, we lock down, we retreat. We open up, we retreat. But there's also different phased approaches in every different country. All the language is different, the regulations are different, etc. So we're going to take some time now to try and really resolve how we can do a better job on this road to recovery and manage it in a way that keeps everyone safe. Because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing, is keeping our people safe. So the first thing we talked about, that first tenet, is all around understanding the risk landscape. Now, many of you have seen these heat maps around the internet that talk about where the cases are occurring, how they're changing. Right now, this says 10 million, but we know over the weekend we crossed the 11 million mark of confirmed cases of COVID-19. But it's more than just understanding this heat map. The heat map is important. It's very, very important to understand where things are changing and what areas of the world are accelerating in cases and hospitalizations. But it's also important to understand more than that. If you're trying to manage a road to recovery and you have a global organization, you also want to understand, well, where are the quarantines? And you want to be able to have up-to-date intelligence on all of those various different impacts. So what countries, what states, what regions are still quarantining or in lockdowns? And that information has to be up to date because, as we know, that's been changing. In addition, there are many different transportation impacts. So as we all start to travel, we also are under different transportation impacts that are also going to continue to change. For example, we understand that the European Union will restrict travelers coming from certain countries in North America and the United States in particular. So understanding all those travel restrictions as this landscape changes is also incredibly important. Not only that, as outbreaks happen, there's going to be different impacts such as production stoppages. For example, you want to be able to get ahead of some of these things if you are trying to manage a supply chain. So if new outbreaks occur in an area where you have suppliers, you want to get out ahead of that. And we also know the recent situation with civil unrest. That started primarily within the United States, and understanding where all those civil unrest activities are occurring, which ones may turn dangerous, is another key element of understanding. But not only that, those protests turned global as well. And we also know that as people are under stress around COVID-19 and lockdowns and quarantines and new outbreaks, that some of that unrest may manifest and continue in different ways. So we have to understand that landscape as well. So in addition to, COVID-19 itself and protests and civil unrest, the last I heard, natural disasters were not on hold just because we're in the middle of a global pandemic. The named hurricanes did not get the memo that they need not hit shore this year because we're too busy with a global pandemic. So you also have to be on top of natural disasters. And it's the intersection of a natural disaster and what's happening with COVID-19 that can create, certain circumstances that are very complex. For example, what happens if you have a hurricane hitting Florida now while they're in the middle of a critical surge in COVID-19? Understanding the trajectory of that, preparing for that is going to make that, even more critical and incredibly important to understand that trajectory. So now that we understand the landscape, how best can we recover our operations? So we've talked about the fact that there's multiple dimensions of complexity. There's social distancing, right? And each, country, sometimes state, region, has different regulations around social distancing. Is it 6 feet? Is it 2 meters? Is it 3 meters? So understanding for each office you have or each facility that you have, what those regulations are important. And different privacy regulations also. So for example, some countries do not allow you to ask a question about symptoms. You can't really talk about specific medical information for the purposes of business. You have to be very careful about that. Other countries are okay with that. Or there's ways in which you can manage and store that information that's very specific to that region. So understanding privacy is important. What are the various PPE regulations around it? So when you put all of these different dimensions together, different regulations for different purposes, for different countries, it can get incredibly complex quickly. So what's really important is having a way to manage that complexity and have a set of standard operating procedures for each facility that are based on the regulations and information that's appropriate for those specific countries. And you can leverage that in a way that they are living standard operating procedures. Because the other thing that is very important to keep in mind is that what we know about COVID-19 changes. We get new information. We get new information from the World Health Organization, from the CDC, from other important regulatory agencies on what they believe is the safest approach to things. So having not only the ability to manage your return to work plans in detail, but to be able to change them on the fly according to new regulations is critical. And as you build out these plans in a way that enables you to manage complexity, you also want to maintain a certain closeness to the people who are on the ground. So for example, in each office, having people that can report back to you their status and make that all in real time is incredibly important. And having it mobile and lightweight, but yet a centralized dashboard for management is also a critical element of being able to get a handle on recovering your operations. So that goes to also this ability to have this dashboard, to understand what's the status of each office or facility, and to understand what happens if there happens to be an outbreak. How do you respond to that? So having a procedure for that, being able to, in the event of a new outbreak, report back according to the public health agencies in that area. What are your legal obligations to report certain cases, outbreaks, et cetera? So all of those are very important things to understand, and also to have an audit trail of what you actually responded, how you responded, what actions you took, et cetera. That's all part of recovering those operations. We also talked briefly about the ability to manage supply chain and having an understanding of where all of your suppliers are, where the routes and stops are, and understanding all of the different risks, whether it's COVID-19 causing a production stoppage or a little hurricane coming, being able to stay ahead of those and track those disruptions is incredibly important. And as things may shut down, being able also to take advantage of supply chain resumption. So we all understood that, you know, when China was in the midst of their crisis, that many suppliers in China shut down. And so that had an impact on many different organizations globally, but being able to take advantage of their resumed activities is also important. So not only is it around stoppages, it's also around resumptions as well. But the one thing that we really came here, I think, today to talk about, all those things are critically important, is how do we protect our people? And we've, you know, talked about a lot of things, but the big topic today is, what about contact tracing? So how do we approach contact tracing, and what does that really mean? So from an Everbridge perspective, we look at contact tracing as more of an end-to-end approach. And it's really all about protecting your people, not just about identifying when an exposure may have happened. It starts much earlier with that. It starts with keeping people safe to begin with. It starts with enabling people to feel comfortable with reporting the fact that they may be positive. And it also includes managing the follow-up for people who may become infected in your organization or who may have just been potentially exposed? How do we make them feel comfortable, let them take the right actions that they need to take so they can return to health and return to their facility? But let's talk first about the technology of contact tracing itself, because that is one of the things that has been on everyone's mind. It's in the press a lot. So there are two known approaches and popular approaches to contact tracing that you hear about. The first is manual, and we know that that's what most of the local governments are relying on. It's very time-consuming, and it's very expensive. So it's not always practical for corporations or universities or other entities. There's also a set of mobile applications that are based on frameworks such as Apple, Google. Now, those frameworks are focused on individual privacy, which is a good thing. We at Everbridge understand how important that is. But they also provided limited insights for public health, and they're not even feasible for corporations or higher education institutions. And they rely solely on people opting in. And we know the statistics around opt-in can be challenging in a public setting. So these two are approaches, but they don't really help solve the problem for many organizations. So let's talk about beyond your typical contact tracing. From an Everbridge perspective, we leverage our own proprietary framework so that we can automate and provide a configurable, flexible framework that you can configure for your privacy purposes. Because every organization is different, every location can be different. We also leverage something called location-based contact tracing, and I'm going to talk about each of these items in more detail, which enables you to leverage other sources of location information to get a more complete picture of who might have been exposed to COVID-19 by someone being positive in a facility or office. And then, of course, there's also physical or area monitoring, which is really more about preventing exposures, which enables you to do things like monitor density to help maintain social distancing. And we'll talk about some of those things as well. And that's really about protecting people before they have a chance to expose others. So let's dig into each of these in more detail. First, let's explore location-based contact tracing. From an Everbridge perspective, we look at someone's profile as a way not only to reach out and communicate with that person during an emergency, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's a terrorist event, or a fire, but also the ability to communicate with them during the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, from an Everbridge perspective, we have sent over 450 million messages in the last number of months that are all related specifically to alerting people to the dangers of COVID-19 and providing them guidance on what to do, whether that's public safety, corporations, higher education institutions, et cetera. So it's across all verticals. And so we can see that we provide information around how to reach out to Diane Wilkinson. That's very important. We also provide location awareness so that if Diane happens to be traveling, if there's a terror event, terrorist attack, or let's say that there's a new outbreak someplace where Diane is traveling, we understand where she may have been traveling. or where her last known location was within a particular facility. Where did she badge in? Where was Diane connected to the Wi-Fi hotspot? All of these different pieces of information can help paint a picture and cast a net around who may have been exposed if someone in a facility happens to be positive, or if there's a new outbreak in a geographic area and you want to make sure that your travelers that were there a week ago can actually quarantine, be protected, get tested, etc. So understanding location is very, very important. So from this perspective, we also provide configurable workflows because that's also very important to organizations and how they want to manage a specific event. So let's imagine that Diane actually becomes positive. She reports positive, whether that's through the Everbridge application or whether she calls HR or her manager and says, gee, you know, I just got tested yesterday and I'm positive. You want to be able to manage that workflow in a way that's appropriate for your organization. So one of the first things we would do is look at where Diane might have been. And we can do a location scan, and that correlates not only where Diane was, but her other colleagues, visitors, et cetera, that may have been in the same area as Diane. And so once we understand that, you have a number of options around this configurable workflow. You can immediately communicate to those people to alert them that they may have been exposed to COVID-19, provide them with additional instructions on maybe where to get tested, the fact that they have to quarantine, whatever is appropriate for your organization. Or you can decide to run a report and determine how you want to reach out to those people. Some organizations we work with want to call people personally. Others want that automated message to go out so that they can really enhance that speed of containment as quickly as possible. But the point is that the workflows are configurable and organizations need to manage those according to what's appropriate for them. Everbridge also provides proximity contact tracing. And this is critical because the benefit of proximity contact tracing is that it really enables you to look at who was within 6 to 10 feet of someone during a certain period of time and who may have been exposed. It's also important to note that with proximity contact tracing, it's leveraging Bluetooth technology, low energy technology, to actually understand who's been in contact. So it's not recording location, it's just recording who was actually near one another. So let's take a deeper look at how this works, because there's a few very important elements to contact tracing from a proximity perspective. So let's imagine that both Alice and Jeff are in the same organization, and they download the Everbridge mobile application, which has proximity contact tracing. They obviously both agree to the terms and conditions from a privacy perspective. That's very important. What happens at this point is that as they're using the mobile application, each of them are generating a key that is only associated with that device. It has no personal information in that key at all. It's randomly generated, it's associated with that device, and if Jeff and Alice get close to each other, they actually exchange keys. So at this point in time, both Alice and Jeff now have keys on their mobile device that reflect the fact that they have been in proximity to one another. And unfortunately, let's say that Alice self-reports that she has tested positive for COVID-19. That's actually an exposure event. So at that point in time, her key will then be distributed to the infected key, will then be distributed to the mobile devices in the organization, and a match will be made to see who was actually potentially exposed. Now, it's also important to note that no PII information is exchanged at this point in time. These are just random keys. A few other important things around being able to have a configurable workflow. So you've got a couple of different options. First of all, you can decide whether you want Alice to be anonymous. That's a setting for you to choose, or whether you want Alice to be known to the organization, so that you can reach out to Alice and say, hey, we understand that you have tested positive. We want to help you. We hope you will quarantine, et cetera. Here's our procedures. You also may want, as I said, Alice to be anonymous. And that choice is really an organizational choice. There are some organizations that are worried that people will be afraid of reporting a positive test result, so they want to make that process anonymous. Other organizations want the ability, really as a duty of care, to reach out to Alice and try and help her out. So you've got those two options to choose from that perspective. The second key thing is, do you want the people who have been potentially exposed to automatically get a notification, or do you want to actually control the timing of that notification, review who was exposed before that goes out, et cetera? That's another organizational choice that you have with proximity contact tracing. And those are important considerations, because one of the key things is around, being able to make sure that people are comfortable and they feel that their privacy is protected. And we have really bent over backwards to ensure that we have covered as much ground as possible that we can to make people feel, comfortable. In terms of the way people identify a positive case, that's literally a simple button on the mobile application, and you can actually configure this. This is another important point, because again, different organizations in different parts of the world may have different restrictions on how something like this would get reported. So this template enables you to, again, you can configure it, but this is just one example of asking someone, so, did you reported positive? You select yes. Then you may ask questions like, when was your test? That way you can determine how far back you need to go in some of your other contact tracing activities. And also questions like, well, have you traveled? Where have you traveled? Again, you can customize this and configure it very easily. And then, of course, they submit their status, and they are, once they've submitted their status, that status then triggers the exposure event. But there are, safeguards here so that people don't accidentally report, self-report. So, one of the things that is key around contact tracing is taking into consideration privacy and security, and that's on a number of different dimensions. The first is the employees and constituents who are going to be the users of the mobile application. You have to be able to adhere to the regional policies like we talked about. You have to ensure that no PII is ever exchanged between those mobile app users. That is very critical. And you also have the ability to have the constituents choose whether or not to opt in to that mobile application as well. The next dimension is the contact tracing team themselves. So first of all, if you are gathering this kind of information, you obviously do not want other people in the organization to have access to different information. So you want to have granular access controls and specific permissions for that contact tracing information. And again, you also want to make sure do you want that self-reporter known to the contact tracing team or not? That's another privacy consideration. The contact tracing team in general has access to those who have been potentially exposed, but only the contact tracing team has that access, and that's important as well. And then, how are you managing that data? What are your security protocols? Are you FedRAMP compliant? Everbridge complies with C5, GDPR. These are important considerations around, managing and working with sensitive information around people's health. So let's talk about keeping people safe. We've talked about contact tracing, and we've given a landscape around the potential uses of that and how to leverage it. But let's hope that you don't have to leverage it, and we can keep people as safe as possible and minimize ever having to use contact tracing. So that starts really with a workflow around how you manage, who can enter a facility. And organizations today are coming up with, a lot of ways in which they leverage Everbridge to manage who's quote unquote eligible to enter a facility and who's not eligible. And there's, again, like everything, a number of different dimensions to consider. There's the needs of the organization. Who is comfortable to return? I talk to a lot of customers who, are ensuring that people who are not comfortable to return to work, if they can work from home, and be productive, they can remain working from home. But oftentimes people have essential functions and they need to be on site, like manufacturing. You also need to consider what are your occupancy thresholds. And then also, of course, what that person's COVID risk status is. If their risk status is low, they're an essential function, and they meet that occupancy threshold, then they should be able to enter the facility. Then there are a certain set of people who, maybe are not comfortable to return. They're really not an essential function, so you want to reserve for social distancing spaces in an office for those people who are essential. And then, of course, if their risk is high, they have a positive test, they have symptoms, et cetera, you want them to, remain at home until they return to health. We also know that in an instant, someone on the left-hand side can actually turn positive, and you have to be able to contain that quickly. So here's some of what people do to manage that workflow and that possible, flow from the left to the right. So first of all, one of the key things is being able to do a daily wellness check. And this occurs when you have a set of employees that are eligible to enter according to your specific guidelines. You provide a daily wellness check to check up on how they're doing. And again, this is something else that needs to be configurable, and it needs to be configurable for different office locations based on local regulations, et cetera. So based on that, you do a daily wellness check following those guidelines. And if the person is fine, if they pass that, they get an approval message that is time-stamped and can be leveraged so that when they report to the facility, they are enabled to enter that facility. If by chance they respond that perhaps they have symptoms, or maybe they don't have symptoms, but they live with someone that's tested positive, they are then moved to the not eligible list. Now, at this point in time, Everbridge also has integrations into badge access control systems so that anyone that's on that not eligible list can be denied entry leveraging badge access systems. That's another important consideration. When people arrive at the facility, a lot of our customers are leveraging temperature checks, which is common practice. And based on someone's temperature, if they are okay, obviously they're approved to enter. Maybe they pass a wellness check, but by the time they get to their facility, they're starting to run a high fever. Obviously, you want to initiate an incident report on that, and that particular person is now not eligible to enter the workplace. Now, for people who are not eligible to enter the workplace, we have to be very careful that they don't feel, like they're, pariahs, right? We want to make sure that we manage that case as best as possible. So Everbridge has automated ways for you to do regular check-ins, to provide them with guidelines where they can go for, testing, things of that nature. We also have a HIPAA-compliant secure chat so that the employee can reach out and feel comfortable talking to HR about certain challenges that they may face. Maybe they're concerned about losing their job, or they're starting to not feel well, or maybe they feel great and they want to go back to work even though they're positive. You want to be able to say, no, you have to test negative before you return to the office. So those are things that Everbridge can help manage as well in a way that enables you to automate, but also balance that human touch that's also really critical in these times. Now let's say that someone self-reports. We talked about the self-reporting piece earlier. Now what happens? At this point in time, once someone self-reports, a incident and an alert goes to the contact tracing team. Again, this is workflow that you can configure. You can decide how this works, who gets these alerts based on someone's location. So it can be very granular on who knows what, as we talked about earlier. Once they get that alert, they can, that contact tracing team can start running exposure scans, and they can choose to notify the people and get everyone quarantined who may potentially have been exposed as soon as possible. And we also talked about the fact that you can automate those notifications with proximity-based contact tracing. Once there's an exposure event and someone has reported positive, that notification can be automated via the proximity-based contact tracing application. One thing to consider is leveraging multiple approaches to contact tracing so that you get the best understanding of who may have possibly been exposed, and you cover all your bases as much as possible. So we have customers that are leveraging a hybrid approach to contact tracing as well. So now we start the cycle again, those that need to be quarantined and those that have self-reported. If you know who they are, you can start that case management. Make sure they have the information that they need, et cetera, to get well again. It's all about getting well. And it really, in essence, this exposure action is all about the speed of containment. And speed and automation is of the utmost if you want to ensure that you contain that exposure event as quickly as possible. So along the lines, again, of keeping people safe, another thing is to enable your constituents, your employees, to check their symptoms at any point in time, to provide a COVID-19 symptom checker. And again, from an Everbridge perspective, we enable this to be configurable based on different regional, regulations, and based on how someone responds to that symptom checker, you can automatically launch an incident and report the fact that they may have been positive. So someone, again, in the contact tracing team can take action, can understand, exactly where they are, make sure they quarantine, et cetera. And finally, keeping people safe, also leveraging information you have from devices, whether they're security devices, building information on ventilation, humidity, temperature imaging, density monitoring. These are all things that can help you understand and automate people's safety. So let's just look at a little bit on how this works. So for example, let's imagine that you have a threshold around building occupancy. So as people badge into the office, as they arrive, let's imagine that at some point in time they exceed that occupancy threshold. At that point in time, you can deny access to further entry, and you can send a notification to employees who are eligible to enter and say, hey, we've hit floor plan capacity. It's been reached at floor 4 on Corporate Drive. Please go to floor 3. So you can actually control this floor by floor to ensure that people are not, overusing one area of a building. So that's one example of being able to automate a workflow based on security input, physical device input, et cetera. One of the main challenges that our healthcare customers face is the fact that they're trying to get their patients back for elective surgeries. And they're trying to ensure that people feel comfortable coming back and returning to hospitals and healthcare facilities. So one solution to that is to provide patients and visitors as well a mobile indoor Wayfinder capability. And what this provides is a way for patients to be guided dependent upon why they're arriving. So if they're arriving because they are, there for a COVID test, they would be directed on a totally different pathway through the facility than those who are there for non-COVID reasons. So there's a safe guidance, a safe pathway for those patients arriving for elective surgeries. So this is critical. We have a number of customers that are taking advantage of this capability. It's all about making people feel safe in terms of, returning to their facilities. This is leveraged today using, mostly in healthcare organizations, but you can also have ways to use indoor wayfinding to manage socially distanced practices so that people aren't going back and forth in hallways. They're following more, one direction in one hallway and then exiting in another, et cetera. So there are other applications of the indoor wayfinding that really help encourage and manage social distance as well. So that's really the approach that Everbridge provides. It's not just about contact tracing, it's beyond contact tracing. It provides a number of different ways to do contact tracing, but it's an end-to-end approach that starts first with keeping people safe. That's the most important thing before they get exposed, enabling them to safely identify the fact that they're positive. Of course, identifying potential exposures and containing them as quickly as possible, and also providing the kind of follow-up that enables people to feel safe and feel well taken care of and get them returned to health and return to working really as soon as possible. So that really concludes the material that we had today. It's really all about how are we recovering, how are we getting everyone back to work, and it involves those three tenets: knowing your landscape, the threats, understanding how to protect your people, and recovering your operations. So I want to thank everyone for attending today, and I know how busy everyone is. We say that, we call it return to work, but it's not really returning to work because I think it's More of us are working longer than we ever imagined. It's kind of returning more and recovering to a more normal life. But thank you. I will turn it over now to Diane for the question session.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for an outstanding presentation. It's full of really useful, helpful information. Before I ask Claudia to address some questions, I want to remind everyone that we'd love to have your feedback in our webinar survey to help us to improve our programs. We will have that available to you soon. But also want to get to the very first question, which is, how do you account for visitors coming to your facilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So from an Everbridge perspective, we think that visitors should be, considered part of your protection, and we consider that part of that holistic approach. So in essence, you would want to ensure that visitors were registered and that you had a record of them within the Everbridge system, and that you understood where they were going to be within the building. So whether that's through badge access, Wi-Fi hotspots, there are other ways to manage that, but so that you can actually ensure that visitors are part of contact tracing should there be some kind of an exposure event.
Okay, great. Next question. We have offices around the world, and so how do you account for different regulations from country to country, such as things like wellness checks?
Yes, so that's a question that a lot of our customers ask, and what they are doing is they're leveraging Everbridge to have different wellness checks for different facilities based on local regulations. And that can be automated within the Everbridge platform. Basically, you just, you initiate a wellness check to a particular group of people based on their, office, location, facility information.
Okay. Another question. You mentioned risk intelligence and COVID-19 information. Can you tell us where you can get that information?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So from an Everbridge perspective, we leverage over 22,000 sources of trusted intelligence information. So we've been doing this for a number of years now. We have our own global risk intelligence center where we have a number of experts that manage this data. And, not only do we have some automation behind it so we can get alerts to you very quickly, but we also have people that do more in-depth analysis on various risk events like COVID-19. We do a number of reports on, trends that are, based on infection rates, production stoppages, supply chain management, et cetera. So our risk intelligence is very rich in terms of covering many, many different kinds of events, over 100 events, including things like COVID-19 specifics, but also more in-depth analysis.
Okay. Here's a question. What happens if the CDC updates their regulations based on new information of how COVID-19 behaves?
Yeah, so I get a number of questions around, how to manage certain aspects of either, wellness checks or contact tracing, et cetera. And I think that the most important thing is that you have a platform that's flexible. So everything within the Everbridge platform is flexible, and you can change different parameters. For example, if they find out that, from a contact tracing perspective, you have to look back 3 weeks, not 14 days, you'll be able to easily change that in the platform. We provide you with turnkey, out-of-the-box workflows as a starting point, but we also know that it's going to change. We know things are going to change, and we've built our solutions on that premise.
Okay. One last question. How do we get our employees to download an app for contract tracing?
So that's a great question, and there's a couple of answers to that. Number one is that if you provide the mobile the mobile device to your employee, you can make sure that it's installed on their behalf already, right? So that's one approach. If they're using their own mobile device, you have to really ensure that they feel safe downloading it, that they understand very well that privacy will not be compromised in any way. So you have to make sure that you know, have education around that, the fact that no PII is ever exchanged on the mobile app. I think that's critical. Also, I think it's important for them to understand that they're really, doing their colleagues a service, and it's for the better good of everyone if everyone can participate. But there's also certain people who won't participate. That's going to happen, and that's why we advocate using other location sources such as Wi-Fi hotspots, which is data that the organization already has, and it's a passive way to collect information around location so that you can understand who might have been exposed during an event. So like anything, having more sources is better than having less sources of information.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. That's all the time we have, and thank you very much to Claudia Dent for the presentation, as well as our sponsor, Everbridge. If anyone has any additional questions or concerns, please go ahead and click the Email Us button on the console there, and we'll be certain to answer that right away for you. You can also visit our website, securitymagazine.com, where you can find an archive of this presentation, as well as information about upcoming events. Thank you, everyone, for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.